Hello out there, my name is Milesy and welcome to my channel. Today I have got a Norberg and Linden water brush set. It says that it is watercolor brushes with a 9x12 pad, so let's take a look at it and see what's inside. It says it comes with 50 brushes, and on the back there are a swatch list, but we're going to swatch it anyway just to see that they're accurate. But I've never used anything like this, so I am really curious about them. Now this box was really heavy, and I think it was because of the pad of watercolor paper that came in it. It's 32 pages and 140 pounds, which was really surprising because normally when you get these things that have paper with them, they're really poor quality and not very nice. So I was really excited to see what this paper might actually be like. The packaging that it comes with is this really funky, weird plastic thing that has two trays inside, and I never really like these because they always take up a lot of space on your desk. You can't really put them anywhere very nicely, so I kind of wanted to find a better way to store these pretty quickly because I'm not a fan of this kind of case at all, really, when it comes down to it. The pens themselves are kind of flimsy feeling. They do have the colors written on the barrel, which is pretty unusual for these cheaper brands I found. They do have bristle nibs, but they're not really the best. They seem kind of flimsy and delicate, and it seems like you can really break them if you don't put the cap on correctly, which is something that kind of makes me a little nervous. As for the swatching, I decided to do it on the watercolor paper that comes with it because I figured that is where I would be using these pens most likely. And at first I thought I was going to do this the way that I normally do with the watercolors that I get in the pans or in the cakes, where I swatch them down on the paper, let them dry, and then put the water over it to see how well they reactivate, but something told me I should try it immediately. And these were marketed as watercolor brushes, and there's a difference between a watercolor brush and a water-based brush, and I noticed that as soon as these dry, they did not reactivate. Neither color wanted to move, so I thought maybe you just need to be really quick, so I put down a little bit more, grabbed the water brush that came with it, and it still would not lift up off of the paper, and I was really starting to wonder if maybe my pens were bad or if I was somehow doing something wrong, but it was the same way for almost every single one of the colors. Some of the colors kind of behaved. You can see the darker ones would reactivate a little bit better, I noticed, but I don't know if that's just because the pigment was darker and you could see more of it getting pushed around the paper, or if those pens were different. But the fact of the matter was they weren't really consistent, and that's what was really starting to get to me by this point. And I got to the black one, and this was where I just really got confused, because as soon as I put the water down on it, this was how I expected every single pen to behave. It reactivated perfectly. Their pigment that was in the marker just went for days and days as soon as I got it wet. So I didn't know if there was just something, if I had got a bad batch or what was going on. And then I tried it on the red, and the red ones seemed to be going well as well, and then it just all kind of fell apart again. So I don't really know what is going on with these markers at all. Of course, then I had to test if they would blend, so I grabbed one that I knew kind of worked, and I decided to take one of the blue ones that really wasn't working, and my camera is not happy about it. And I tried to put those together, and they didn't really blend very well on the paper because they are water-based, and I haven't really talked too much about water-based markers on this channel yet, but they don't blend very well. So I tried to blend them with the pens themselves, and that didn't work. So I tried maybe hoping that the red would somehow encourage the blue one to reactivate, and all that happened was I just smeared a whole bunch of red all over the place, which I still don't really understand what was going on with these markers. I grabbed a plastic bag that was just sitting there on my desk, and I scribbled a big pool of ink on it with one of the blue ones that didn't work at all. And I picked that up with the water brush that came with it and was really surprised when I saw that this was what worked, because that really seemed to completely defeat the purpose for me. If these are pens or markers, I would like to use them as a marker. I don't want to have to sit here with a separate palette and scribble down on the plastic and then pick it back up. At that point, I might as well use one of the watercolor sets that I have that are meant to be used this way. But somehow when I did it this way, the colors not only activated properly, but they blended really well. And that just drove me nuts because that made no sense. I didn't understand what was going on at all, but I figured I might as well try to see if I could get them to work at all in a normal kind of way. First did my sketch in my sketchbook, like I'd been doing there for a while with a lot of these. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. Just kind of started sketching until something came out. And what came out was this really cute fox. I've been drawing a lot of foxes on this channel. I don't know why, that's just kind of been what's coming out the most. But I don't do a lot of paper sketches. So they're kind of an awkward thing for me to do. I have a really hard time keeping everything consistent and keeping everything on the same plane. A few of the ones that I've posted recently, their faces are weirdly twisted and kind of distorted because I'm just not good at drawing on paper. So that's something I've been really trying to work forward at doing a lot better, is doing my drawings on paper and getting it all sketched down without using my iPad and without using my little digital dolls that I like to use a lot. So I knew that there was going to be a lot of water involved on this, so I wanted to do my outlining with my pencil instead of any kind of ink, because this is actually filmed a couple months ago, so I was really not comfortable with my pens at all. I'm still not really, but I'm getting there. So I wanted to do the outlining with my pencil, which I do really like the outlines with the pencil, but they take so long, so that's kind of a special thing, I think, and not something I'm really going to do a whole lot, probably, unless I really feel like the piece needs it. For the actual markers themselves, I wanted to try to use them the way that I would expect watercolor markers to behave, which was that I wanted everything to kind of bloom out and spread after I had done it. So I was going to lay down just a solid patch of color for everything, and then once that was done, I was going to spray it down, and I did try that, and you'll see that a little bit later on, but it really did not work very well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these markers, what I liked about them, what I didn't like, and I think I'll start with what I liked about them, because there is actually some that I did. They did layer surprisingly decently if I really put my back into it. I was able to get a little bit of yellow shining through on his green eye, which really surprised me, and I loved the spread of colors. This had a really nice palette that you could get a lot of colors out of, and if you could manage to get them to layer and blend, you can get even more out of them. I do also think that they were really comfortable in my hand. They were a nice size. My hand didn't cramp up the way it does sometimes when I'm using alcohol markers, because the markers are so big that they're just awkward to hold on to. But these were a really nice size, and there wasn't a whole lot of weirdness to grip onto. But that caused a problem, because that is about the end of where I liked these markers. But because they're so thin and they're so small, what kept happening, and you can already see that on his nose, is that the markers kept running out of ink and kept drying out almost immediately as soon as I was using some of these colors. And a couple of them I picked up and wasn't even able to use them because they were just instantly dry. And I think you can see this too around his eye. I just couldn't get enough pigment down to get a smooth gradient. And at one point, I think I even had to switch the color that I was using because it just wouldn't go any farther at all. And this right here was when I was already starting to have some doubts about where this was going to go, because I knew from the swatches that this probably wasn't going to work too well, what I was trying to do, and I probably should have been using them the way that they seem to be intended to use. But I was really hoping that maybe if I could just get enough pigment down that it would work in the end. But I was really struggling to really get any down at this point. It just didn't want to go. It didn't want to stay. And it was a streaky, messy mess, which if these had worked, I don't think it would have mattered. Even if they were dry, I don't think that would have mattered at all, that they were streaky and messy. And yeah, I just switched out for another shade of brown. I wanted what was in his ear to be the same color, but it wasn't really working, so I grabbed another one. And even that one, that's the first time I was using it, was really streaky. So far, his tongue and his eye were the only ones that I was able to get really smooth color down on. And for a while, I even thought that maybe I should shade this, but I didn't know how they would react if I shaded them, and I just wanted to see at this point how they would work at all, doing what I wanted to do. But I think the first thing that I noticed but didn't really think was going to be too big of a deal was that this, as a watercolor set lacked white, which I have a couple palettes that for some reason didn't have white, which is weird, but it's not super uncommon, especially with the really cheap ones. So I figured, well, maybe they just couldn't get white ink, or however the watercolor worked. But looking back in hindsight, they probably don't have white because these aren't watercolors at all. They're just water-based markers, and certain pigments seem to smear better than others, is what I have noticed. So because there's no white, there's really no lighter colors at all. This was the lightest one I could find. Doing something like this fox meant that I had to get really creative with the colors, because I didn't have anything white that I could put there on his face. I didn't have anything kind of in that really lighter range. And the colors are all really bright and overly saturated too, which normally wouldn't really bother me, because for watercolors, you can typically unsaturate them and desaturate them and use water to dull them down a little bit. But because there's no white and because these don't behave, I wasn't able to do either one. And another thing that really bothered me, on top of just constantly running out of ink, I even wound up having to pull it apart at one point to try to get the ink to come out. On top of that, it was really hard to get the caps back on. A lot of times I would put the cap on and didn't notice that it hadn't snapped into place, and then I would pick it up later and the cap would just fall right off. So I'm wondering if they were just dried out because the caps weren't on them correctly in the first place, or if they were just dried out because they were bad. I really don't know, and I can't tell. And at this point, I was already really starting to give up on anything working, because the fake white that I had used there was already streaking and not really working. And then as soon as I picked up the orange, I noticed the same thing, that it wasn't putting down any pigment at all. I couldn't get consistent color, and I don't know. I don't know if that's by design. I don't know if these are supposed to mimic watercolor by not working, or what the actual deal is, but the whole thing was just really frustrating. And at this point I knew that it wasn't going to work. I had hoped that I'd be able to get a certain effect out of it, but at this point I knew that it wasn't going to happen, that these watercolor markers, whatever you want to call them, were grossly mislabeled, I think is probably the best way to put it. But I wanted to like them. I really love the concept of supplies that are two things at once. So like watercolor markers, paint markers. I have some acrylic paint markers that I love, and you'll be seeing those pretty soon. Those were great. So when these weren't, it was just really disappointing. But nothing I did, whether it was really short strokes, really long, slow strokes, nothing I did really seemed to work. So I was just hoping that I could get around the edges, and then maybe it would work. And if the inner bit of his shoulder wasn't totally colored in, it wouldn't matter, but it just wasn't working. And I think I grabbed another shade of orange because that one just was refusing, and they were all the same. A couple of them worked really well, but most of them did not, and the entire piece wound up looking like this. And then I did decide, well, at this point, maybe I can save it with some shading, which didn't really work, and I think in the end just made an even bigger mess than what it wound up being, but I wanted to at least try to make it look good. And then I also tried to give it just a really quick background, and that didn't work either. And another thing that really bothered me about these was that the colors on the end and what were on the caps really didn't match the colors that you got. So you can see over there on my little protector sheet that I kept having to swatch things because I'd pick it up and I'd try to use it, and it wasn't at all the color that it looked like it was going to be. So I had to do that a lot, which that's pretty common with a lot of these cheap ones. That shouldn't have really surprised me, but with everything else that was going wrong with these, it was just one more thing that was irritating me. And I do kind of feel like had these worked, the background that I'm adding just should not have happened. Because if these had worked, the background would have really screwed it up. But at this point, I just wanted some color down there. I wanted to make it look like I was trying, that I knew what I was doing, even though these markers were not behaving. And I still don't know why a few of them worked, but most of them didn't. And I can see the other reviews that people leave for these because I got this through my review program. I'm not going to leave a link for these because they were terrible. But I could see the other reviews, and only one other person really seemed to think that there was a problem. Everyone else gave them to their kids, saw that their kids were having fun, and said, yes, these are great. But I guess if you're giving them to a 3-year-old, they'll have fun. So first what I was trying to do is I grabbed my airbrush and I just filled it up with water, and I was trying to spray it with water, kind of hoping that would be enough. But I went in knowing that it wasn't going to be because I already had my spray bottle. And there are a few places where I could almost see that what I was trying to do was working. Because what I wanted to do was I wanted the colors to kind of bloom out and blossom and bleed on the wet paper into one another, and then have the pencil kind of be there implying the fox. And then what wound up happening is the only color that ran at all was the brown. Nothing else ran, so it just wound up looking like I had spilled water on my painting. Nothing behaved at all. I don't know why only the brown ran, but it did. The blue in the background didn't even run. I kind of wanted that. I was hoping that would blossom out, but I think this is something I want to try with some of my other watercolors and see if I can get the same kind of effect, get that to work, because I think it can look really nice, but it did not work with these, and I let it sit there. At one point, I even just poured water over it, and still the only thing that bled was the brown, and maybe a little bit of the orange. I don't know, but it was so overpowering and so irritating. And even wet when I put the markers down on the wet paper, even that didn't really get the effect. It didn't smudge out any of that really streaky stuff. It didn't help smooth anything. All it did was run the brown. So yeah, I put a paper towel over it and I sprayed it really heavily with water, and then I let it sit there for like an hour. And when I came back, nothing had changed. So I think these are probably the worst supplies I've got yet. They did not work, which is unfortunate because I have some of Norberg and Linden's acrylic paints. And I really liked their acrylic paints, but their watercolor pens were not great, which is very unfortunate, but it was an adventure to try, I guess, unfortunately, but hopefully next time we'll get something a little bit better that will behave. And if I see these again, I have been told that they are looking into making them behave a little bit better. So if I see them again, I am going to pick them up again and give them another go. But as they are right now, I cannot recommend them. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, all that fun stuff. And I will see you next time. Bye!